Lee. The carriage that carried Marianne Ravenscroft up the long avenue of Greythorne Hall set her down at the servants' gate, and not one soul among them knew that the gravel under her boots had been laid by her grandfather, or that she had once counted every lime tree in that avenue on her fingers, naming them after the months of the year. She had given the name Eliza Carow to the man who hired her, Belul. She had given it twice more, once to the housekeeper, once to the woman writing it into the great leather book of wages, and each time the false name had come out steadier than the last until she half believed it herself. That was the only way to survive the thing she meant to do. You could not walk back into the house that had been stolen from you as Lady Marianne, daughter of the late Earl. You had to come in sideways. You had to come in low. You had to come in as a governess in a black wool dress 2 years out of fashion, with a single trunk and a face arranged to show nothing. The housekeeper, a square, capable woman named Mrs. Tilbury, looked her over the way one looks over a horse before market. "You're younger than I expected," she said. "I'm 28, Marianne answered, which was the truth, and one of the few true things she would say for a long while. "And you've taught before?" "In Halifax, a merchant's family, the 2 girls. None of it real, all of it rehearsed on the long rail journey north until the lies had worn smooth as river stones. She had learned in the 18 months since she lost everything that a lie told without hurry is rarely questioned. People do not look hard at a quiet woman who keeps her hands folded. "Well," Mrs. Tilbury sniffed, "the child is difficult. I'll not pretend otherwise. His Grace took her in after his sister died, and she's not spoken above a dozen words to anyone since the spring. You'll have your work cut out. The child." Marianne had not known there would be a child, Lady. The letter that had drawn her here, answered from a coffee house in the city, signed with the false name, had said only that a household in the county of Eldadale wanted a governess of sober habits, and that the wages were fair. She had taken it because of the address, Greythorne Hall, the only 2 words in the world that could have moved her. They went in through the kitchen passage, past the still room and the cold larder where she had once stolen plums as a girl of 6, and Marianne kept her eyes down because she did not trust them. The house smelled the same. That was the thing that nearly broke her in the first hour, beeswax and coal smoke and the particular damp of old stone, and underneath it all the faint green smell of the moor that came in at every window no matter how tight the frames. She had spent 18 months teaching herself not to weep, and the smell of her own childhood undid half that work before she had so much as taken off her gloves. Her room was in the attic, under the eaves, where the servants slept. She had been born 2 floors below it. That night she did not sleep. She lay on the narrow bed with her hands behind her head and listened to the house tick and settle, and she made herself remember coldly, and in order, why she had come. Her father had died in the November of 2 years past, and within a month a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her life had arrived with papers and a solicitor and a claim. Roderick Ravenscroft, a second cousin from a thin branch of the family, had produced a will, her father's will, witnessed and sealed, leaving Greythorne and its lands and the whole of the Ravenscroft fortune to the male line, to Roderick, and to Marianne, nothing but a small annuity, and the contents of her own clothes press. She had not believed it. Her father had told her, more than once, in the library with the fire low, that he had made provision for her, that she would never be at any man's mercy, that he had seen to it. But the will Roderick produced said otherwise, and the law did not care what a dead man had once said by firelight. The law cared what was written and sealed, believing. She had fought it as far as a woman of no money, and no name could fight anything, which was not far at all. And she had lost, and Roderick had sold Greythorne within the year to a stranger and taken the money south, and that, by every account, was the end of Marianne Ravenscroft. except that she did not believe the will was the will her father had made. She had spent 18 months not believing it. And somewhere in this house, if her father had told her the truth in that library, there was another paper, an earlier one, or a truer one, or some proof that the thing that had ruined her was a forgery. He had said, "I have seen to it." A man does not say that of nothing. So she had come back as Eliza Carrow to find what her father had hidden in the house that knew her even if no one in it did. She heard the moor wind come up against the slates and she thought, "I have a year, perhaps. Until the lie wears thin. Until someone looks at me too long." And then she slept after all. The hard sleep of someone who has finally arrived at the place she has been walking toward for a very long time. The child's name was Tabitha. She was 7, small for it, with her uncle's dark coloring and a way of looking at adults as though waiting for them to leave. Considered. On the first morning she sat at the schoolroom table and would not pick up the slate. On the second she would not pick up the slate. On the third, Marianne stopped asking her to. "I won't make you do sums today," she said, and sat down across from her and took out instead a small green book she had carried up from the city. "I'm going to read, and you may listen or not, as you like." She read a story about a girl who was given a key to a garden, and she did not look up to see whether the child listened because she had learned that a thing watched too closely will not grow. By the second week Tabitha had moved her chair around the table to see the pictures. By the third, she had said 4 words. By the fourth, she had told Marianne, "They'll hide them," in the flat, careful voice of a child who has decided to risk something, that her mother used to read to her, and that no one had read to her since. And Marianne had to turn and tend the fire so the child would not see her face. It was through Tabitha that she first saw the Duke at close hand. She had glimpsed him before, a tall figure in the long gallery, a back at the far end of the dining room, the sound of his horse in the yard before light. The household spoke of his grace the way you speak of weather, as something that arrived and departed and could not be argued with. He had bought Greythorne site largely unseen, they said, 18 months back, and he kept to himself, and he was not unkind, but he was not warm. And the late master, meaning her own father, had been a livelier man. God rest him. She had braced herself to hate him. He had her house. That was reason enough. He came to the schoolroom on a gray afternoon in the 4th week, without warning. And Marianne rose from her chair too fast and curtsied too low and was furious with herself for both. The Duke of Aldermere was perhaps 35, dark, plainly dressed, with the kind of stillness that other people mistake for coldness because it gives them nothing to push against. He looked first at the child, only then at the governess. "Mrs. Tilbury tells me she's speaking," he said. "A little, your grace. More than a little, by the account." His eyes came to Marianne's face and stayed there a moment. The way a man checks a sum he suspects of being wrong. "You've done in a month what 3 before you could not do in a year." She did it herself. I only stopped getting in her way. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, the ghost of where a smile would go. An unusual thing for a governess to admit. He crouched then, level with the child, and Marianne saw the whole stiff architecture of the man rearrange itself into something careful. "Tabitha," he said, "will you show me what you've made?" The child looked at him a long moment, weighing. Then she pushed her slate across the table. On it, in the wandering hand of a 7-year-old, was a drawing of 3 people standing in a row before a square house, and underneath, in letters Marianne had taught her that very week, "Home, Fa." The Duke looked at it for a length of time that Marianne would remember afterward, because it was the first thing about him she could not square with the man she had come prepared to despise. He looked at the drawing of the house, her house, and something crossed his face that was very near to grief. And then it was gone, and he stood and thanked the governess in a voice gone formal again and left the room. Marianne stood at the window and watched the rain start over the moor and thought, "He has secrets in this house too." She did not yet know that the thought would cost her everything she had come to protect. She searched at night, when she could, and on the half-days the household allowed her. She searched the way a careful person searches a thing they cannot afford to be caught searching, slowly, and putting everything back exactly. The library first, because that was where her father had spoken to her of provision. But the library had been the Duke's now for a year and a half, and his books had crowded out her father's, and the great desk where the Earl had written his letters was gone, sold or burned, she never learned which. She tried the muniment room, where the estate's deeds and rolls were kept, and found it locked, and found that the housekeeper carried the only key on a ring at her belt, and put that puzzle aside for later. She tried the long disused rooms in the east wing, where the furniture stood under sheets like a company of ghosts, and where the dust on the floor showed that no one had walked for a year. It was there, Lolita, in the last week of October, that she found the music room. It had been her mother's. The Countess had died when Marianne was 11, and her father, who had loved his wife past all reason, had closed the room the day after the funeral and never opened it again. And the will of the new owner had evidently been the same, for the sheets were exactly as the servants had left them 17 years before. Marianne lifted one and found the pianoforte beneath, and her mother's work basket, and on the wall, in its frame, the watercolor her mother had painted of the south front of Greythorne in summer, with the lime trees in full leaf. She sat down on the dust-sheeted stool, and she let herself, for 1/4 of an hour, simply be Marianne Ravenscroft in her mother's room. It was the first time she had used her own name, even in the silence of her own head, in many weeks, and it frightened her how much it cost to put it down again afterward, and become Eliza Caro and go back up to the attic. But before she went, she did what her father had taught her without ever meaning to teach her anything. Girl, she had watched him hide things. A letter, a ring, once a small sum in gold. In the false back of her mother's writing desk, the little walnut desk that had always stood by this window. Some things, he had said once, catching her watching, are best kept where only love would think to look. The desk was still there under its sheet. Her hands shook as she felt along the underside of the writing slope, found the catch, pressed it. The compartment held a packet of letters tied in ribbon and a single folded paper sealed with her father's seal. She did not open them there. She could not have read a word in that light, and besides, footsteps were a danger in the empty wing. She put them inside her bodice, against her ribs, and she put the sheet back over the desk and the room back to its long sleep. And she went up to her attic with her father's secrets warming against her skin, and she did not sleep at all. The letters were her mother's, written to her father in the years of their courtship, and they were none of Marianne's business, and she read every one of them anyway, by candle end, weeping, because they were the voices of two people who had loved each other, and were both now dead. But it was the sealed paper that mattered. She broke the seal at last near 3 in the morning and read it again, and then she sat very still in the cold while the candle guttered, because it was not what she had hoped for, and it was something far stranger. It was a letter in her father's hand, addressed to no one, dated 3 weeks before his death. But he wrote that he had made a true will, leaving Greythorne and the bulk of his fortune to his daughter Marianne, with provision that no marriage and no man should ever take it from her. That he had grown afraid, in his last months, that his cousin Roderick meant him harm, that he had therefore lodged the true will not with his own solicitor, whom he no longer trusted, but with a man of law in the city whose name he set down, Mr. Hale of Coltsmore Lane. He wrote that if anything befell him, and the true will did not come to light, His daughter was to go to Mr. Hale and ask for the Ravenscroft deed, and that Mr. Hale would know her by a token, which was. And here her father had written a thing that made Marianne press her hand to her mouth. The name of the lime tree she called December. She had named them as a child. He had stood in the avenue with her, holding her hand, and let her name all 12. December was the crooked one nearest the gate. The one that flowered late. No one else alive knew that. No forger, however clever, could have known that. So there was a true will. There was proof. It was in the city, with a stranger, waiting for a token only she could give. And the thing that had ruined her was a forgery after all. And she had been right for 18 months against the whole weight of the law. She should have been glad. She was glad in the part of her that had walked north for this. But she sat in the cold attic and found that gladness was not the whole of what she felt. And the reason for that was the man 2 floors below, who had crouched to look at a child's drawing of this house and let grief cross his face. Because if the true will stood up, then the sale was void, and Greythorne was hers, and the Duke of Aldermere, who had done her no wrong, builder, who had bought in good faith from a thief, and never known it, would lose the house he had given a motherless child to call home. She had come back to take her house from a stranger, but she had not reckoned on the stranger having a face. November turned hard and the moor went the color of old iron. She did not go to the city, but she told herself she was waiting for a half-day long enough to make the journey, which was true, and she told herself she was being careful, which was also true. And underneath both true things sat the one she would not look at, which was that she did not want to go yet. She saw the Duke more often now. He had begun to come to the schoolroom in the afternoons, on the pretext of his ward, and to stay longer than the pretext could account for. He was a man who had taught himself silence, the way she had taught herself a false name, and for the same reason, because the truth had once cost him too much. And she recognized the habit in him because she carried it in herself. They talked, when they talked, of small things. The child's reading, a book, the weather coming over the tops, and around the small things there grew, without either of them naming it, the shape of something neither had asked for. "You don't speak of yourself," he said to her one afternoon, by the schoolroom fire with the child asleep over her slate. "In 3 months I've learned the whole of Tabitha and nothing of her governess." "There's little to learn, Your Grace." "That," he said, "is the answer of someone who has learned a great deal and means to keep it." He was not smiling, but he was not cold, either. "I won't press you, but I, of all men, have no right to press anyone for the truth of themselves. Why you, of all men?" He looked into the fire for a while. "Because I bought this house," he said, "to spite a dead man, and I've regretted it every day since, and I've never told a living soul why." He stood before she could answer, as though he had startled himself, and bid her good evening, and went. And Marianne sat with the sleeping child in the dying fire, and understood that whatever she did now, she could no longer pretend that the man she was about to ruin was a stranger. She learned the why by accident, a week later, from Mrs. Tilbury, who had taken to her and grew talkative over the household mending. The Duke's wife, the housekeeper said, had died 5 years past. She and the babe both, and his Grace had not been the same man since, and it was grief and not greed that had brought him north. He had wanted, the housekeeper said, somewhere with no memory of her in it, a house with no ghosts of his own. He had bought Greythorne because it was far and empty and belonged to a family entirely unknown to him, and he had brought his orphaned niece here because the child, like him, had nowhere else that did not hurt. "He's made a home of it," Mrs. Tilbury said, biting off a thread. "First place in 5 years he's called home. You can see it in him." Marianne went up to her attic and was sick with the truth of what she held. The will in her bodice was a true thing and a just thing, and it would give her back her name and her house and her father's good faith vindicated before the world, and it would put a grieving man and a silent child out of the one place either of them had been able to bear to live. She did not sleep. By morning she had decided nothing except that she could decide nothing yet, and she went down to the schoolroom hollow-eyed, and the child looked up at her and said, unprompted, the longest sentence she had yet spoken in that house. "Miss Carrow, you look the way Uncle looks when he thinks no one sees him." And Marianne knelt and held the child and did not trust herself to speak. It was the muniment room that forced her hand in the end. She had wanted, before she went south, to be certain, to see for herself how the false will had been entered, what record the house kept of the theft. She got the key at last on a December afternoon, when Mrs. Tilbury was laid up with a chill, and sent the governess, of all people, to fetch a ledger. Marianne fetched the ledger, and then, because the chance would not come again, she did not lock the door behind her, but searched, fast and frightened, through the deed boxes and the rolls. And she was so deep in it, with the false will open on the table before her and her own true name written 100 times in the old estate books around her, that she did not hear the door. "Miss Carrow." She turned, and the Duke of Aldermere was standing in the doorway, and he was looking not at her, but at the document open under her hands, the will, with the name Marianne Ravenscroft written plain across it in the bequest of an annuity. And then he was looking at her face, and she watched him do the sum at last and arrive, after a year and a half, at the answer that had been standing in his schoolroom for 3 months. "Ravenscroft," he said quietly. "The daughter." There was no lie left that could survive that room. She let Eliza Carrow go. It was almost a relief. "Yes," said Marianne. He did not shout. She had braced for shouting and got instead something worse, which was a man going very still. He came into the room and shut the door and stood with his back to it, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the wind on the slates that had been the sound of her whole childhood. "You came into my house under a false name," he said at last. "I came into my house," she said, and could not keep it down, "under a false name, because it was the only door left open to me. My father left it to me." "The will your cousin," she caught herself, "the will Roderick Ravenscroft sold you Greythorne under is a forgery. My father made a true one. I have proof of where it lies." She was shaking, but her voice was not. "I did not come to deceive you, your grace. I did not know there was a you. I came to take back what was stolen, and I found a child who draws this house and calls it home, and I have spent a month unable to decide whether to ruin her to save myself." She had not meant to say that last. It came out of the deepest part of her, and it changed the room. The Duke looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had lost its formality entirely. What was under it was not anger. "Show me," he said, "the proof." "Show me, and tell me the whole of it. And then—" He stopped, and she watched him reach for fairness, in a moment when most men would have reached for advantage. "And then I'll tell you what I think a just man ought to do, even when it costs him the only home his sister's child has known. Because I bought this house in good faith, Miss Lady Marianne. But I'll not keep it in bad." And there it was, the thing she had not let herself hope for, offered freely by the man she had come to dispossess. He had every reason to call her a thief and a liar, and have her turned out into the snow with her false name, and no witness to gainsay him. Instead, he had asked her to show him the truth that would unhouse him, because he would rather be right than safe. But she understood, standing there, that she had badly mistaken stillness for coldness, the way the whole household had, the way perhaps his dead wife had not. She showed him. She told him all of it, the library, the letter, the lime tree named December, Mr. Hale of Coltsmore Lane. And here the story turns, for a little while, to the man, because there are things he understood in that hour that she could not have known. The Duke of Aldermere had spent 5 years certain that fairness was a thing you owed the world and got nothing back for. He had been fair to physicians who could not save his wife. He had been fair to the cousin Roderick, whom he had thought a sad case fallen on hard times, never dreaming he had bought stolen goods. He had grown so used to fairness as a kind of penance that he had forgotten it could also be a kind of door. Bissow. A woman stood in his muniment room with the deed to his undoing in her hand, and her chin up and grief in her eyes that matched his own. And he found, to his great surprise, that he did not want her gone. He found that the thought of the schoolroom without her in it was worse than the thought of losing the house. He had not felt the wanting of anything in 5 years. He had thought that part of him had died with the rest. It had not, it had only been waiting, the way the late lime tree waits past all the others to flower. "I'll send to the city myself," he said, "for Mr. Hale will have the truth of it under law, and properly, so that no one can ever take your name from you again." He paused. "Whatever it costs me?" "And the house?" she asked. "The house is yours, if the will stands. It was always yours." He looked at her steadily. "I'll not pretend that's easy to say, but I find I'd rather lose Greythorne to its rightful owner than keep it as a thief's gift." They sent to the city. Mr. Hale came north on the railway in the 2nd week of December, a small, dry, exact man, Billy, and Marianne gave him the token, December, the crooked lime by the gate, and watched his careful face open into something like wonder, for he had held the true will for 2 years and feared its owner dead. The forgery fell apart under his examination like wet paper. By the new year the law had spoken, and it had spoken her name, and Greythorne Hall and the whole of the Ravenscroft fortune were hers, free and entire, with the provision her father had set down that no man should ever take them from her. Roderick Ravenscroft was found in the south and arrested for the forgery, and that is the last he need trouble this account. She stood, on the first afternoon of her ownership, in her mother's music room with the sheets taken off and the watercolor of the lime trees bright again on the wall, and the Duke of Aldermere came to find her there, with his hat in his hand, like a man who has come to take his leave. "The house is yours," he said. "I'll have us gone by the week's end. Tabitha and I will do well enough. There are other houses." He was being fair again. She could see what it cost him. And here was Marianne's choice, and she had thought about it through every night of that long month. And she found, when the moment came, that there was nothing to think about at all. "You forget," she said, "that the house is mine now, to do with as I please. My father's will is very clear on that point. No man may take it from me, but it says nothing about who I may keep in it." She crossed the room to him, later, Lady Marianne Ravenscroft on her own floor, in her own house, by her own right at last. "When I came to Greythorne, I came to take back a thing that was stolen. I have taken it back. It's mine, and no court and no cousin and no false name will ever make it otherwise." She drew a breath. "And now that it is wholly mine, and no one on earth can say I was forced or tricked or sold, now, with my whole self free to choose, I find I do not want to live in it alone." The Duke went very still again. But she had learned to read his stillness now, and what was in it was not cold. "I won't be one," she said. "Not at a card table, not in a will, not by any man's claim. But I might be chosen, and I might choose. There's a great difference, and I've paid in 18 months of my life to learn it." She put her hand out, the way he had once crouched and put his out to a frightened child. "Stay, not because you must, because I'm asking." He took her hand. Outside, the snow had begun over the moor, the same snow that had fallen on her childhood, and the lime tree stood bare and patient in the avenue, the 12 of them, named for the months, December, crooked, and last by the gate. The house that had been taken and lost and searched in secret and won back held its breath around them, and for the first time since either of them had known what it was to lose everything. The great gray rooms of Greythorne Hall were not the scene of any theft, nor any grief, nor any lie, but only of a woman who had come home by the long road, and a man who had stopped at last being merely fair, and a small girl asleep 2 floors above who had drawn 3 people before a house and called the picture by its right name. Some inheritances are written in wills, and some are stolen, and some you must creep back in disguise to reclaim. But the truest one cannot be left to you by